Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another session of Focus Weekly for Ethics. Here we shall take four articles from the previous week newspapers and try to analyze them from the perspective of our GS4. The first article that I'm taking up for the discussion is this: Supreme Court's journey reflects evolution in rights and reach, says the Chief Justice of India. Here in the article, there's a point highlighted. If I zoom in, we can read it properly, clearly. Transformation reflects a deeper recognition that justice must be both principled and practical. And this is our theme for discussion now. We will look into the theories that talks about how justice can be principled and the theories that says how justice can be practical, and then look at some of the examples how Supreme Court has tried to tie up these two things together, principle and yet justice being practical. The theories of justice are many. Some of them we have been discussing in the previous discussions. The theory of justice can include the Kantian theory of categorical imperative. Principled justice, meaning that the behavior, the state machinery's mechanism, will come only and only from principles. So, first of all, there has to be principles laid down, and secondly, there has to be commitment, unwavering commitment for those principles. And one such principle is categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant. According to Kant, there is no exception to moral duty. The three categorical imperatives that has been laid down by Kant, according to him, there is no exception to those. It has to be always, in all circumstances, followed. So when we apply the categorical imperative, this deontological approach to justice, we have the ideas in our legal jurisprudence that the rights are inviolable. Human dignity cannot be violated. Article 21 is never suspended, even during emergency. And all the fundamental rights under normal circumstances have to be ensured. It's a duty of the state. Equal respect under the law, right to fair trial, regardless of crime's severity. Day before yesterday, there was a news article where one of the judge of the Supreme Court was saying that our justice system gives complete justice. And he remarked, in reference to one of the cases that came for appeal from Delhi High Court, that we gave the right to judicial remedy even to Ajmal Kasab. There is no exception. Everybody is treated in the same way, and laws applies to everybody. That is deontology. There is no exception to moral duty. This is principled justice. Principled justice can come from other theories, like the natural law theory of some of the philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, that the laws, the natural laws through which we get the natural rights, they are universal, they are inherent, they are innate. And the rights that we have, that is at the time of the birth, it is prior to and independent of the sovereign. So natural rights theory suggests that those rights, protection of those rights, is the prime duty of the state. And we see the application in the constitutional fundamentals, the basic structure doctrine, or the human rights protection under the Constitution, that the focus of our Constitution is also rights, on the fundamental rights. Constitution, there are many approaches to justice theories. One of the approach we just saw is duty-based approach to justice. The other approach to justice could be rights-based. And our Constitution also has adopted the rights-based approach. If you see in Article 13, it has been said that nothing mentioned in the third part, beginning from Article 14, can be abridged. The state has the duty to preserve, protect, enlarge the third part, the fundamental rights. That is primarily rights-based approach. So it is also principled justice that the rights of the citizens must be guaranteed. They must be gradually enhanced. So you see the liberal interpretation of Article 21 by the Supreme Court, addition of more rights within the ambit of Article 21. Gradually DPSP, the right to education, they are brought from the DPSP to the fundamental rights. The rights must be protected. That's also principled justice. Duty must be fulfilled. That's also principled justice. And John Rawls, we have talked about John Rawls in the previous discussions. John Rawls gave a very specialized theory of justice for large institutions, in working of the large institutions. And his area of development of the theory of justice is procedural justice, in the procedures, in the functioning of the large institutions. And his idea of justice is fairness. Fairness, no biasness, no prejudice. And the instrument that he has in his theory for development of fairness is veil of ignorance. Through veil of ignorance, and we have discussed the idea of veil of ignorance earlier as well, you forget about your interest. You forget about where you belong to, whom are you related to, who are your friends, who are your family, where is your business interest, where are your investments, what are your profit motives. You forget everything. Now, since you forget everything, you have no inclination. If you are able to forget, suppose you are able to forget everything, then how will you work? John Rawls says now you will work with your sense of justice, just your sense of justice, nothing else. Because there is no inclination. You can go this way or that way towards him or her. There is no inclination. So, what do you have? You have your original inclination. An original inclination of a man is to work for justice. John Rawls says that all human beings are born with sense of justice. So, wearing veil of ignorance enables us to deliver justice in a principled way, not through emotions, not through biasness, not through any other intentions, through the principles. And John Rawls suggests that if you wear the veil of ignorance and try to figure out the principles, he claims in his book that anybody will come up with these two fundamental principles. Liberty principle, as we have talked about this earlier as well, suggests that there will be basic equal liberty, there must be basic equal liberty to all, like fundamental rights of India. They're guaranteed to all citizens in equal measure. So liberty is to be ensured, but in equal measure. John Rawls distributed liberty in equal measure. So he's a libertarian and he's an egalitarian because he talks of equality in terms of liberty. So he is a libertarian egalitarian. Basic equal liberty to all. And he says that the difference principle has to be there, and the socio-economic inequalities must be arranged in society to benefit the least well off. First, he talks of liberty principle. Difference principle is the exception of liberty principle. He talks about equal basic liberty. But special provisions can be made. Special provisions can only be made to benefit the least well off. That's the condition. For example, progressive taxation system. Progressive taxation system, some people are taxed 30%, some 20, some 10, some 5, some none. Different people are taxed to different proportion of their income. That is inequality. But that's okay. That's inequality is arranged in a way to benefit the least well off. Least well off have to pay less taxes or no taxes. So that is exception to equal basic liberty, but that's okay. These are two principles, and if we work with these principles, then that is principled justice. Similarly, justice can also come from expression of virtues. Aristotle has said that ultimately, moral behavior comes from settled moral character. Development of character should be the focus for delivery of justice, like judicial integrity, ethical code of conduct, professional standards, judicial accountability measures. There, the focus is on virtue, and they're also important for delivery of justice. There are other principles through which principal justice can be ensured, like the theory of social contract or the capability approach of Martha Nussbaum or Amartya Sen. Social contract has many ideas. The contract between citizen and the government is such that the government will work for the well-being of the citizens and citizens will honor, respect, and follow the laws, the commandments, the orders, notifications, ordinance of the sovereign. It works both ways, but citizens are obliged to follow if and only if the sovereign work for the welfare of the citizens. And to ensure that the sovereign work for the welfare of the citizen, there's a concept of limited government. They can't do anything and everything. They can't do certain things. Like what they can't do according to Article 13 of Indian Constitution is they cannot abridge the third part, the fundamental rights. And protecting that, the judiciary has come up with the basic structure doctrine. So government has to be essentially limited, and your politician must have told you that the purpose of fundamental right is to limit the state. That's the fundamental idea. The government has to be limited. Not to limit the government, there are other instruments like right to consent. The citizens have to give consent to what the sovereign can do and what they cannot do. So the bill has to be passed through the parliament to become the act. That is the process of taking the consent. Citizens give consent, not directly, but indirectly through their representatives in the parliament. They give the consent. That's the idea. And that forms the fundamental principles of lawmaking, fundamental principle of trusteeship, fundamental principle of accountability, probity, transparency that comes from the social contract. So justice can be delivered by these approaches. These are principled justice. For example, in the case of Nanda Bharti case, Supreme Court propounded the basic structure doctrine. And the principle essentially used for that doctrine is constitutional integrity. In the Shabrimala judgment, in the Triple Talaq case judgment, in these judgments that Supreme Court gave in the spree of judgment from 2018, Supreme Court has worked with the principle of gender equality, with the principle of liberty. And Supreme Court has iterated many times that liberty of individuals in the context of gender, that's gender equality, cannot be overshadowed by the demand of social conformity. So on those principles, the judgment for Triple Talaq, the judgment of Haji Dargah in Mumbai, the judgment for Shabrimala judgment, the Hadia judgment, Supreme Court has worked with the principle of liberty of both genders, ensuring gender equality. That is principled justice. However, there are many theories for practical justice. For example, the idea of legal realism from philosophers like Oliver Holmes, where the idea is that law in action has to be balanced with laws in books. An empirical approach has to be adopted rather than idealistic approach. Social consequences must be taken into consideration. For example, Supreme Court has evolved the interpretation of Article 21 to include many things. Right to hold a passport and go to foreign visit is also under Article 21. Based upon the context and based upon the requirement, Supreme Court keep expanding the scope of Article 21 to make it practically applicable. There are pragmatic legal theories, and according to those theories, the laws must have workable solutions. Practically, you must also see the cost benefit ratio of what you are going to do. And there must be practical outcome in the real world for the laws, for the procedures, for the judgments. For example, environmental judgments balancing development with ecology. Supreme Court, with some restrictions, has allowed tourism also in the hilly regions, in Western Ghats. So balancing that and making it practical, there are theories that suggest justice basically come from the root word jus, J-U-S, jus. Jus in Latin means to synthesize. Whatever are the practical considerations, they must be synthesized with the goals, idealistic goals as well. Then we can look at the practicality or the practical application of justice theories through utilitarianism, where philosophers like Bentham, J.S. Mill will support the idea that justice must be practical and there must be measurable outcome coming from justice. The utilitarianism theories, outcome-based theories. Previously, we have seen virtues, duties, rights, contracts, consent, capability. But this philosophy of utilitarianism is interested in measuring the outcome. And that makes it practical. Like public interest consideration in land acquisition cases. The land acquisition cases, there you see the greatest good for the greatest number. Public projects that require land and public projects beneficial in general for everybody. Some people may have to pay the cost. You have to minimize their suffering, maximize the happiness, at the same time minimize the pain. And so in the land acquisition bill, you have the title as land acquisition, transparency, fair compensation, rehabilitation, resettlement. Now this transparency, fair compensation, rehabilitation, resettlement is to minimize the pain of those who have to shift because of the land acquisition. And land acquisition is for public projects, for enhancing the well-being of people, for bringing greatest happiness to the greatest number. So, but practically you'll have to allow that to happen, and practically some people have to bear the brunt. You have to try your best in order to minimize that. Practically, there will be suffering of some people. That's practical justice. Economic analysis of laws by some of the philosophers, like efficiency in law, transaction costs, incentive structures. They also have to be considered. For example, insolvency and bankruptcy code implementation, implementation of the GST. That is the practical. Although there were problems and there were concerns of the violations of autonomy of the states and their taxing rights, but to make the system overall efficient, practical, it was done. That's practical justice. For sociological jurisprudence, like to see the social needs, like Supreme Court has ordered to have three genders, the third gender as well in the government forms. Previously, it used to be male and female. That's it. But now for the transgenders, there has to be a column for or a box for the third gender. Justice must also do therapeutic function. For example, the healing function of giving psychological comfort, removing the anxiety, problem solving, like the Lok Adalat, the family courts that does the mediation. That is the practical need of our time. When the divorce rates are rising, there has to be some alternative mechanism for arbitration away from the intimidating environment of the normal courts, where a situation is amenable for reconciliation. That must be done. These are the practical aspects of justice. The theories of justice, these practical aspects, they emphasize on implementable solutions, workable within the resource constraints, recognizing the social context, measurable outcomes, systemic efficiencies. Supreme Court. I also have given you many examples in this, but separately I must give you some more examples. For practical justice, you see, you might recall or you may not if you are new into the preparation. Supreme Court has given a judgment in 2017, in the Putta Swami judgment, right to privacy was included in the fundamental right. Recognized privacy as a fundamental right, but allowed reasonable restrictions for practical need like national security. So your data of Aadhaar can be collected by the government. You can't say no to that. For national security, for efficiency in public service delivery, some of the data, or like age, like sex, other demographic data can be collected, and you can't deny that. It's allowed. So right to privacy is a fundamental right, but the collection of some data doesn't violate right to privacy. That's practical justice. Mining bans modified with regular operations. That would balance environmental protection with economic needs. Supreme Court has allowed regulated mining in Goa, also in some parts of Karnataka. That is a practical justice. Supreme Court also has integrated principal justice with practical justice. As I just talked about in Aadhaar judgment, there is protection of privacy rights, and regulation has been put that the data from the Aadhaar server cannot be retrieved by anyone lower in rank than additional secretary. Any government officer can't do that. That's protection of the data that's collected by the government, but allowed limited use for welfare delivery. Previously, the data Aadhaar was made mandatory in anything and everything, even the SIM card of Geo. They were not giving it without Aadhaar, and they were accepting no other identification document instead of Aadhaar. The Supreme Court has put a regulation. You can't do that. If I don't want to give data to private organization, they can't make it mandatory. But for some welfare schemes, government can collect it compulsorily, and government may make it mandatory to give Aadhaar data for those welfare schemes. So that is balancing the principled judgment that right to privacy remains fundamental, but some part of the private data has to be given. That's practical for the efficiency to remove the inclusion and exclusion error in the government schemes. Similarly, in COVID-19 judgments, Supreme Court has in short declared again that right to life is paramount, but it allowed reasonable restrictions on movement. Public health needs to be ensured apart from individual rights. So the fundamental rights holds still, but restrictions also can be imposed. That's what the Chief Justice of India was referring to. The Supreme Court has evolved and has delivered justice which is both principled and practical. All right. According to Aristotle, ethics has two fundamental characteristics. I've added three here, but I'll focus on the first two: universality and contextuality. This is principled. Same principle has to be followed always. Fundamental rights was there still during the time of COVID-19, but restrictions can be imposed. That is practical. Looking at the context, the principles can be applied differently to different measure, can be expressed to different degree, and that is practical. And these two are fundamental characteristics in the theory. Ethics is universal and also contextual. So it is principled justice and also practical justice. That's what it was about. The next article that we are going to take now: why has the US often exited climate pacts? Previously, in the previous tenure, when Donald Trump became the president, he exited from the UNESCO Paris Agreement. Then in the Biden administration, they came back. And now it seems that the policy is moving in the same direction. And so far, the US president has freezed all the foreign aid. They'll do the evaluation, and maybe for some they will resume. But right now, all the foreign aid is suspended. And perhaps they will pull it back again from the international treaties and conventions. So the question this article is asking: why has US often exited climate pacts? Now, the answer to that and what should be done for this not to happen, let's discuss the two aspects. The answer to that is ethical egoism. The word ego means desire for self-preservation. Desire for self-preservation, that's what ego means. Not necessarily a wrong thing. To self-preserve, it's not necessarily a wrong thing. That helps us to move on in life, that helps us to go through difficulties and still survive, that gives us hope in life. We have desire for self-preservation, that's why we do not have the general tendency of doing suicide. It's a good thing, helps in preserving humanity. But the question is, at what cost? At what cost do you want to preserve yourself? That's the question. And answering that question will decide whether ego is moral or not. Ego should not trump the larger goals of morality. The self should not become more than the whole. Parts can never be more than the whole. So, ego on one side, conscience on the other side. Conscience is working for the rest of the humanity, considering other fellow humans as ours and having their active consideration in our decisions. So, ego bhi hai, conscience bhi hai. And ego cannot trump conscience. But ethical egoism versus global ethics, which one will you choose? Ethical egoism's position will lead to national self-interest, making that as paramount. And there will be resistance to international financial commitments. And people break commitments. At international level, most countries, they break the international commitments. And that is because of ethical egoism. America first policy. The economic sovereignty that they always had, but now they want to preserve it because the resources is getting drained in the Ukraine war. And Germany and France, they're having it tough on their economy. Money is gone into the war, and seemingly it is not ending. Trump is a businessman. For a businessman, money is the most important thing, and he won't give money that easily. He won't. So this economic sovereignty is very important. Maintaining the finances of their country is very important. It should be. For a president, it should be. Trump has recently remarked Pittsburgh, not Paris, in reference to exiting from the Paris Agreement. Protection of US oil and gas interest. These are the priorities. These are the aspects of ethical egoism. But collective global responsibility, shared environmental commons, international cooperations, these should be the priorities for global ethics. Solution to this problem there could be two kinds of things that we can talk among many things. One is we can talk from the idea of contract. The contract is mutual agreement for collective benefit, and there has to be commitment for this contract. The contract is about mutual benefit, collective benefit, shared responsibilities, and the shared rights, and consensus, consensual governance structures. The international conventions. Paris Agreement, for example, it was consensual. Under Paris Agreement, nationally determined contribution was to be submitted. How much you're going to contribute for climate change mitigation? What will be your efforts, your mechanisms? How much greenhouse gas emission reduction you are going to do? How much of renewable energy you're going to add into the production of electricity? Nationally determined. You will do it yourself. So there is no imposition. These are fundamental elements of contract. And these elements are there in the international treaties. In UNFCCC, uh, these all the elements of a basic contract is there. In Paris Agreement also it was there. But the point is, what is that element that will help a country or any individual hold on to contract? And what will decide that we don't break our contracts? See, in one of the previous video that we had, I think last to last week, I have discussed this idea. And that John Rawls has beautifully explained. John Rawls has given the idea of veil of ignorance. And he says that we must first decide things behind the veil of ignorance. And once the veil is removed, we should agree to what we decided behind the veil of ignorance. Idea of veil of ignorance you must have picked up by now, that you have to forget who you are. So if you don't know the economic status, the geographical location, your vulnerability to climate change, how close you are to the sea level, the fossil fuel resources, how much of that you have, or the technological capability, if you don't know this, that is wearing the veil of ignorance. You forget that you're the president of US. You don't know how your country is, which country, even if you're president or not. You just have to decide as just a human being, forgetting all these things. Then what are you likely to choose? If you really don't know these things, and if you can get into that cognitive level, that state of mind, that you really don't know these things, then what are you likely to choose? You're likely to choose a strong emission control because you don't know if you're in Polynesia or if you're a very small country, if you're very vulnerable like Madagascar, you don't know. Then you will choose a strong emission controls. You will choose a fair burden sharing. You don't know your capability of technology. You would like the technology to be given to you in case you don't have it by those who have it. Protection of vulnerable nations, technology transfer, universal access to clean energy. You would want to have these. Now, what John Rawls says is, you decide behind veil of ignorance, and in this context, this is how you will decide. What he says is a very crucial thing, that once the veil of ignorance is removed, and now you realize who you are, and you found out yourself to be the president of US. You know your country is developed, and you know that you're having a stiff competition from China, and you don't want to cut down your emission. You don't want to fall behind in that race of growth. So you will be tempted now to break the contract. The moment you realize that now, man, you're at the advantageous position. You're not Vanuatu. You're not the small islands in South China Sea. You are very vulnerable. It's not the case. So you will tempt to break. And John Rawls said, yes, this is the most crucial point in the contract. Once you realize who you are, you still hold on. You still hold on to what you have decided behind the veil of ignorance and fulfill your promise. And that is what is going to maintain the contract. The only way out is that people practice fairness, people practice impartiality, and the certain tools given in philosophy. One of the famous tools is the veil of ignorance of John Rawls. And following that, you accept the responsibility. Their historical emitters, they must not resist the responsibility. Vulnerable nations should not bear the disproportionate impact. The benefit and the burden, they both of them must be equitably shared according to Aristotle. So climate reparation to some degree, technology sharing, capacity building, equal per capita emission rights, protection of the vulnerable sections, this must be done. But how will it be done? It cannot be done unless we develop our sense of justice, unless we become impartial and fair. It cannot be done. This article concerning the suspension of the tungsten mining contracts in Tamil Nadu. And this using this article, I will discuss something mentioned in the syllabus. If you see your syllabus in the beginning, the very first thing in the syllabus is ethics and human interface. And there could be many human interfaces. Human beings can have interface with administration, with constitution, with society, with environment. And one of the interface I'm going to discuss here, society having interface with environment. And here I shall discuss that what does society need from environment and what does environment need from society. And for these two needs to be met, what should be at the interface? See, society needs certain things from environment, like society needs sustainable resources. For example, Western Ghat biodiversity. We require resource from environment. We require life support, like Ganga River ecosystem. We require natural balance among the resources and in the ecology, like Sundarban mangroves. They provide us. We require environmental services, like the Himalayan watershed. Environmental services like pollination, they are also environmental services. We require climate stability, predictable monsoon patterns. We require ecological harmony. Ecological harmony that the sacred groves provides. We require also maybe natural heritage like the Silent Valley National Park from the environment. Among many other things, these are the things that society need from environment. What environment in turn need from society could be ethical stewardship. Stewardship is good ethical management administration. Like Chipko movement could be an example of well good management of forest or environment or nature. Conscientious consumption. There are ideas of zero waste cities and there are ideas of carbon neutrality. The amount of emission CO2 that you're emitting out, you also absorb it through some technology, through carbon capture, through afforestation. What environment needs from society, from people, is just conservation. Conservation, biodiversity conservation, Project Tiger, Project Elephant, ideas of biological parks, ideas of national parks, biosphere reserves. Society needs moral responsibility that was reflected in the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Environment want from people sustainable development that regulations through green tribunals, also through the judgments of the Supreme Court's directives of the Constitution can be done. Environment requires from society sustainable practices like organic farming, ecological respect, respecting the indigenous knowledge of the indigenous people, tribal people. Society, environment would expect this from society, and society would expect this from environment. For both the expectations to be fulfilled, there has to be value integration. There has to be sustainable harmony, like living in harmony with the nature, like the Bishnoi community in Rajasthan, like the Malhar community in Gujarat. There are many of the tribal communities, they are very famous for preserving some species of plants or animals. Value integration, your economic value, social value, religious cultural value can integrate with the environmental values. The sacred grooves, the sacred ecology. They're sacred because it is given religious sentiment or cultural sentiment, so it is sacred. And protection of the grooves, that's ecological value, environmental value. Green tribunals are for the same purpose. They have to regulate the development and enable growth, economic value, but in a sustainable way without causing undue damage to the environment. That's environmental value. Balance and synthesis, mutual respect, like community forest management, shared responsibility, joint forest management, ethical development, like green buildings. Similarly, some framework that you must work with. Warli practices, Warli paintings, Warli practices. You must have read about this in art and culture. And in Wali practices, huge respect is given to nature, to sustainability, to the environment. Modern conservation, like wildlife corridors. And there are many techniques that you must have studied in your ecology, that wildlife corridors can be made even when you're constructing the roads, maybe in an elevated platform, and maybe you cover it with greenery so that it doesn't look like a human made infrastructure. Solar villages uh, work with framework to enable balance and synthesis and enhance the capacity, like Swachh Bharat, ethical awareness, and the capacity building infrastructure, bio toilets, dustbins, etc., within the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. The beach cleanups, water harvesting, these are the requirements that society has to develop as and when it interacts with environment. So, the general question that comes regarding environmental ethics are the case studies regarding balancing the rights of society and environment. We should deal with these three columns: the requirements of society, the requirements of environment, and how it can be enabled. The fourth article that I'm going to take up in the discussion here is this. Siddharamaiah expresses concern over falling conviction rate in atrocities cases. The conviction rate, if you know, combining both civil and criminal cases in India are very less. It's around just 40%. Conviction rate, low conviction rate is a matter of great concern, huge concern. Conviction rate is counted from the time the trial begins, not from the trial time where the arrest is done. When the trial begins, only 40 out of the 100 go to jail. 60 go scot free. And that's a matter of concern, because then why did the trial begin? If you didn't have the evidence, the trial should not have begun. Trial begins when the investigating officer has prima facie evidence and the judge has looked into the evidence and is satisfied. So he gives the permission for the trial to begin. Then the trial begins. Trial begins, but he is not convicted. Not convicted because later on you do not produce concrete evidence. And laws works on evidence. So the question is, why is the conviction rate low? The answer is because of low, poor moral aptitude, poor aptitude of evidence collection. You cannot do it. Poor aptitude to give legal arguments. You couldn't argue legally properly, and you couldn't collect the evidence properly. That's why. It's a matter of concern. Weak, poor aptitude among civil servants, among the officers of government, is the biggest cause of non performance of duty. And UPSC has once asked, is non performance of duty a form of corruption? The answer is plainly, wholly, solely yes. Gandhi has written in Hind Swaraj that the performance of duty and observance of morality are convertible terms. The same thing. Performance of duty and observance of morality are the same thing. If you cannot perform your duty, then you're not observing your morality. He focused on duty. He also belonged to the school of thought of deontology. So there are three ways in which you can go wrong. The very last topic in the syllabus is challenges of corruption. And it is challenging to manage corruption. Very challenging. Very, very challenging. And there are three ways in which you can do corruption: by violating your ethics, by violating your integrity, and by violating your aptitude. The ways in which you can go wrong with ethics is violating the normative ethics. In the article, certain things are mentioned, like failure to protect vulnerable communities, discrimination of the legal proceedings, violation of procedural justice, violation of duty to protect the vulnerable community, violation of expression of virtues, you're not expressing sensitivity, empathy for them, unequal treatment under the law. We did John Rawls, two principles: liberty principle, equal basic liberty. But unequal treatment is violation of that principle. You can violate the professional ethics, police filing counter complaints to weaken the cases filed by SCSTs. It's there in the article. Deliberate delays in investigation, improper handling of bail proceedings. That's violation of professional ethics. Poor supervision of case progression. Administrative ethics, lack of monitoring mechanism, Failure to maintain professional standards. Either you don't have one or you don't enforce that. These are the problem of ethics. There could be problem at the level of integrity, like institutional integrity, declining conviction rate. For SCSTs, it's given in the article that the conviction rate has declined from 10% to 7%. Systemic weakening of the cases, failure to maintain institutional standards, compromise in investigating quality, and the personal integrity, willful negligence in duty, or deliberate mishandling of evidence, or accepting inducements, the bribes. And that's violation of personal integrity, violation of procedural integrity, improper filing of charge sheets, manipulation of legal processes, compromised investigation procedures. Integrity comes from dutifulness, it comes from obligation, it comes from motivation. If you don't have those elements, then you violate integrity. So you can go wrong at ethics, you can go wrong at integrity, but yet you can go wrong in other ways. And that is lack of aptitude. Maybe you are not ill intentioned, you have good intentions, but you just cannot get the evidence. Your investigating skill is very poor. And maybe the legal argument, the way you're framing the arguments, and that is not convincing. So decision making capacity, poor judgment in handling sensitive cases, failure to recognize ethical implications of the judgments of the arguments, inability to maintain impartial stance. In these cases, it is understood that in most of the corruption cases, it is the aptitude that is the main problem, not ethics and integrity. For example, the poor collection of taxations, that's the poor aptitude of the tax officers for advance assessment of the taxes. It's a poor aptitude of the extension officers in agriculture for not informing the farmers on the prices, on the right usage of the fertilizers, on the crop selection. Uh, the officers of the extension service, they ought to have done that. There are many problems in agriculture, the problem of monsoon and non-availability of irrigation facilities, and the non-accessibility to market, and lack of technology and small land holdings. There are many, many, many. One of the important problems that agriculture did not take off after independence is because the extension officers did not have the aptitude to fulfill their obligations. Extension services for agriculture has not been successful. When the officers don't have aptitude, then they ought to do non-performance of their duty. They will be bound to do. They will not be able to fulfill their duties if they don't have aptitude. So it's not a matter of low conviction rate. Whenever there is poor performance in any areas of governance, largely it is because of poor aptitude. So it is the requirement of an officer to develop aptitude. So Aristotle has said the purpose of life must be to self actualize, become the best version of yourself. Self actualization, developing the capacity, expressing the virtues to the fullest. That must be the purpose of life. And on every human, even more so in civil servants, it is important to develop moral aptitude.